Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Louisa Lawrence, Marketing and Commercial Manager for Integro Accounting. Now here at Integro, we specialise in providing accountancy services to contractors, freelancers and small businesses. And today I'm delighted to welcome you to our 30-minute GDPR webinar. Now this session is recorded, so for your privacy, we have muted your camera and microphone. However, I encourage you to ask as many questions as you would like using the comments tab. So here at Integro, we work with some of the best partners in the business. So with that in mind, we welcome Nadia from NAC, our cybersecurity expert, who will be leading today's discussion. So today we'll be looking at the responsibilities of being GDPR compliant as a freelancer and how you can protect yourself and your business. So enough from me, let's waste no more time. Over to you, Nadia.
Thank you so much, Louisa. Bear with me while I share my screen in just a moment and we can kick off. So my name is Nadia Kadim. I am co-founder, CEO of NAC, and I am a GDPR lawyer, which is why Louisa has kindly invited me today to speak to you all about GDPR for SMEs and freelancers alike. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the GDPR. So I thought let's start with a little bit of an introduction to what is the GDPR. Now, some of you may already know, some of you may think you know, so let's just get all of our noses in the same direction. The GDPR is the data protection legislation. It started in the European Union, and then when Brexit happened, the UK took over the EU GDPR and turned it into the UK GDPR. And it is aimed at protecting the privacy and personal data of people, natural persons, as we call them under the legal definition, which is people like you and I. Now, there is hardly any difference between the UK GDPR and the EU GDPR, but what you have to know if you are processing people's data is where your data subjects are located, because that is exactly the thing that informs which piece of legislation is applicable. So let's say you have a customer and the customer is in the European Union, then it doesn't matter that you're in the UK, you still have to abide by the EU GDPR and vice versa. Now, like I said, both pieces of legislation are designed to protect individuals' personal information and enhance privacy rights, which is great for us all. And the law gives a framework of how to actually collect data, store it, protect it, and how to share it as well. So, why you should care about GDPR, something I hear from small businesses and freelancers often is, but nobody really cares, nobody really will find out. Why should I care? Isn't the GDPR more for the big companies amongst us? And the answer is no. Complying with GDPR is not only necessary to protect yourselves from fines and legal trouble, which definitely is true, and what we're seeing is more and more actually fines and legal trouble also for SMEs and freelancers, but in fact it will help your customers trust you and it will aid your reputation, and if that isn't a reason to abide by GDPR, I don't know what is. So first things first, to start with, because you may have heard of these terms before, just wanted to set out the difference between a controller and a processor, because that's everything that the GDPR is based on. Now, the GDPR sets the rules for both controllers and processors. Controllers are those organizations that are responsible, accountable, and liable for processing data in a legal way. You can ask yourself the question whether you are a controller by asking yourself, are you able to set the rules around the data processing? Are you able to define why you're processing data, who from, what types of personal data? If the answer is yes, then likely you are the controller. But we also have something called a processor, and a processor under GDPR is the organization that processes data on behalf of the controller. So when you are doing your work, and let's say you are an SME and not just a freelancer, if you are an SME, you have 1 or 2 employees or even more, and you have some customers, you can be a controller for the data regarding your employees, and then you can be a processor at the same time for the data regarding your customers. So it really depends on the moment in time and what data you are processing, which role you assume. When we talk about personal data, just to make sure we know what we're talking about, the GDPR applies to personally identifiable data, meaning the data that you have needs to lead to a person, whether it's directly or indirectly. So this can be names, email addresses, date of birth, but even things like a gender, a copy of your passport, obviously. All of those things are personal data. So even if you just have a name in a spreadsheet, and it's just a first name, then you might not think this actually doesn't really lead to an individual person, does it? But if I then combine it with another spreadsheet I have somewhere else that actually has the last name as well, it becomes a lot more identifiable. So it doesn't have to be directly identifiable, but also indirectly. So that personal data is what the GDPR is protecting. Now, the basic principles of GDPR, firstly, you need to have a lawful basis to process data. Now, this lawful basis, there's actually more than the 3 I've listed here, but these are the most common for freelancers and SMEs alike. Now, there are 3 that I want to go into. So, firstly, sometimes in some cases, you have a legal obligation to process certain data. This is especially the case if some of your customers are, for instance, the government. Examples of this is, for instance, schools, they have a legal obligation to process certain children's data. In most cases, this won't be applicable though. The second one is legitimate interest. Now, this is interesting. Legitimate interest is where you don't necessarily have a lawful basis. You also don't have the third one, which is consent, but you still have a legitimate interest in processing the data. Think about direct marketing. We're all businesses, whether we're big or small, we all need to make money and get customers. So sometimes in order to get new customers and ensure that the businesses that we all have survive, we have a legitimate interest to contact people on LinkedIn, on email, and send them a little bit of information about our offering. Now, that's completely fine. This is then based on legitimate interest. And then finally, another lawful basis is consent, and that's easy. As long as you have permission to do anything, to process data, you're allowed to do that. Now, consent needs to fulfill a couple of requirements. It needs to be freely given. The consent needs to be explicit, and a couple of other bits and pieces, but the gist of it is you need to have consent in case you base your processing on consent. Now, the GDPR also asks you to implement something called data protection by design and data protection by default. And this is often where people think, hey, what do GDPR and cybersecurity have to do with each other? Now, this is exactly where cybersecurity comes into play when we're talking about GDPR. In order to be compliant with the GDPR, you actually have to implement cybersecurity measures. You have to implement data protection measures. You need to do this in advance in designing your business processes or your product, hence by design, and also by default. So you have to make sure that your measures are just implemented and they can't easily change, they can't easily get lost in, the day-to-day. You implement the right cybersecurity measures. And then finally, another basic principle of GDPR is fairness and transparency. You need to make sure that once you have that legal basis for processing, you've implemented the right data protection measures, that you are on a continuous basis being fair and transparent about what you're doing with personal data. Fairness is, are you processing data for a certain goal? Let's say you collect people's email addresses because you want to send them a newsletter. Now, when you're collecting their email addresses, you're asking for their consent. So we know our lawful basis is consent. We have ensured that no bad actor can get to our list of email addresses. So we've implemented data protection. But then also, we can't then suddenly start using their email address to do something else instead of sending that newsletter. We're now also going to sell it to another company. That is not fair, which is in breach of this fairness principle of GDPR. You always have to be transparent about what you're doing it, why you're doing it, who you're sharing data with, how you're protecting it, how long you'll keep it for, and this is transparency. Now, there are a number of other basic principles of GDPR, but this is an intro to GDPR. I haven't listed out all of them. When you search on Google for basic principles of GDPR, you'll find sometimes 6, sometimes 7, sometimes 8, but you'll see some of these mentioned there and you can find the rest online. Now, there are three, and going back on the slide 1 second, what we will go into now is, okay, how do you implement the GDPR? And there are 3 main pillars of GDPR, main sort of topics and how you can implement them. And that's when we're talking about people, processes, and technology. So GDPR is very much about protecting personal data and therefore protecting the people whose personal data we're processing, we're collecting, we're using, we're storing, etc. People are a big risk because people can make mistakes. They can accidentally send a list of information to the wrong recipient. They can accidentally not update their computers, whereby a virus comes in and that causes a data breach. People are the cause of a lot of incidents revolving around data. So how do you minimize that human risk? So in order to comply with the GDPR, you want to minimize human risk, and there are ways to do that. So firstly, training. Train yourself if you're a freelancer, or your people if you're an SME, on GDPR, how to deal with data subject access requests or deletion requests, how to deal with incidents and when to report, how to spot phishing emails and how to secure your accounts. All of these topics your people need to be trained on these topics at least once a year. So every single year you need to redo the training. It can take many different forms, it may be online, in person, a book, whatever, but you need to show that you've done it, how you've done it, when you've done it, and that you'll do it again. Then we want to lay down processes and documentation that your people will read, but we'll actually go into the processes and the documentation after this in processes. You want to test these processes, but again, we'll go into that in more detail. And then finally, you want to ensure that your contracts are in order. So apart from training, processes, testing processes, you want to make sure that you have the contractual obligations for data security in the contracts with either yourself, if you are a freelancer, an employee, if you are an SME, your suppliers, your contractors, anyone. The contractual obligation for data protection needs to be in there. And then finally, in order to protect yourself, you can also think about liability and ensuring that the liability clauses within your contracts with employees, in the case of an SME, your suppliers, your contractors, is all taken care of. Because if you breach GDPR and there is a fine, then it's really important that you've laid down the rules of liability and sort of the division of liability between yourself, your employees, your contractors, etc. So that's people, out of people, processes, and technology. Now moving on to processes, we need to have a number of processes in place. Now, the most important topics from GDPR I've written down here. So we need to think about data retention, meaning when are we going to keep and when are we going to delete data, international data transfers, supply chain management, data subject requests, and incident response and data breach notification. Now I'm going to go into more detail for these. Data retention is actually an interesting topic because the GDPR actually does not set data retention terms, contrary to what many people think. So the GDPR says you must not process data for longer than is necessary to reach the goal for which you actually collected that data. So again, let's go back to our example of collecting people's email addresses to send them a newsletter. Let's say you have a little pop-up on your website. People can say, yes, I consent to you sending me marketing communications. I would like to receive your newsletter. Now, when you stop sending out newsletters, do you then really still need to keep onto that email address just in case? The answer is you shouldn't, but it doesn't really, the GDPR doesn't really say like you have to delete it after X amount of years, 5 years. It just says you need to decide when it's no longer necessary. So that's up to you. But there are a couple or a few data retention periods that are in fact dictated by the law, but it's not the GDPR, it's actually other pieces of legislation. Let's say legislation surrounding taxation, employment law, HR stuff. So you need to, for instance, anything to do with taxes, you have to retain for at least 7 years. So anything that could be relevant for the taxman when they come and check us, we should retain invoices and receipts and that sort of thing for 7 years. Then, talking about international data transfers, does this really apply even when I'm really small, if I'm an SME or a freelancer, micro business? Yes, it does. The GDPR states that you can, and this is the British GDPR, the UK GDPR, but it is the same for the EU GDPR. It states if you process data outside of my geography, so in case of the UK GDPR, it's the UK, EU GDPR is the EU, EEA, actually, in fact, then you must have safeguards in place to make that international data transfer legal. Now, some cases, the authorities have actually said, hey, this country has adequate data protection, so actually, even though you're sending it outside of the UK, you can send it to that country without problems, without any additional safeguards. That's called an adequacy decision. Now, both the UK and the EU have taken a number of adequacy decisions for a number of different countries, and you can find those online again. If you use a cloud application, let's say Google Workspace or Microsoft Office 365, even though you are in the UK, there is a big chance that there is an international data transfer for the data that you store within your Google Workspace or your Office 365, because the headquarters of those companies are in the US, and the US headquarters still have access to the data from their subsidiaries and their customers. So there is, in fact, a big chance that in your day-to-day work, you are sending data overseas and that you have an international data transfer on your hands. Now, for the US, there is no adequacy decision. For those situations, you can rely on a number of other things. You can rely on a thing called standard contractual clauses or binding corporate rules. Now, some organizations have put in place, big companies usually have put in place binding corporate rules, and if they are adequate and if they say that the data protection is really stringent and encryption and anonymization, etc., is all in place, then the Authority of Data Protection or the ICO might actually say, oh, that's enough. But the easiest way is something called standard contractual clauses. So the UK and the EU both have published a set of standard contractual clauses that if you put them in your contract with this supplier in question, with Google Workspace or with Office 365 or Integro, let's say Integro was in the US and you were sending data to Integro in the US, it was an international data transfer, you could put those standard contractual clauses in your contract with that supplier, and then you are covered under the GDPR. Now, in some cases, when it's something called a high-risk transfer, there are actually additional safeguards necessary, and that's usually encryption, anonymization, and pseudonymization. I can never pronounce those words. Louisa, please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. But those are
good.
So those are the three sort of additional measures you can take. Then that has to do with the next thing called supply chain management. And again, you may think supply chain, I don't have a supply chain. That's just for enterprise and corporates and Microsofts and Googles of this world. And that's not true. No matter how big or how small, there is a big chance that you have a supply chain. So you have suppliers, whether that is Integro or your local IT provider or whatever, your accountant, or your apps like Google Workspace, your CRM system, your accountancy systems, etc. Those are all suppliers to you. And you have a responsibility under GDPR to make sure that your suppliers are taking the same, if not more, security measures as you are. So let's say that you have financial data, and you have credit card numbers, including the CVC code and everything. That's quite high risk, because if that credit card information was leaked somehow, someone could commit financial fraud or even identity fraud, right? So it's quite high risk. So you need to make sure that you take the measures to protect that data. Once you've established what those measures are, your suppliers need to take the same, if not more, measures to protect that data. Then data subject requests. So under GDPR, your customers, your employees, in case you're an SME, your suppliers, anyone whose data you are processing have the right to put in some requests around deletion or erasure, a restriction, access, limitation, portability. They can object. So those rights are very specific in the GDPR, and you have an obligation to react to those in a timely and lawful manner. Now, the GDPR states exactly what it is you need to do in your reply to those requests and what you need to do in order to deal with that request properly. And the important thing to remember is you've 1 month. 1 month is a hard deadline. You have to have solved this data subject access request or this data subject deletion request within 1 month. And then finally, incident response and data breach notification. So in case there is a data breach, you have to inform the Information Commissioner within 72 hours. Again, hard deadline. You have to ensure that you give them the necessary information, which again is listed out in the GDPR, and you can find it online. Yeah, that's a hard notification deadline. These processes need to be written down. So you need to have all of this in your policies, in your documents, and you must also inform your data subjects of how you're doing this in your privacy policy. So a lot of companies have, or websites, they have privacy policies, and what people often think is the GDPR is just to do with cookies or just to do with your website, but that's not true. Your privacy policy is explaining to the world what data you are collecting and processing, why, from whom, how long you're keeping it, what you're going to do in terms of a data subject request, how you're going to reply, when you're going to delete the data, etc. So that needs to be transparent, going back to our basic principle of fairness and transparency. Now, and I realize I'm going through this very, very quickly, but we only have half an hour, so I'm going to try and do my best and continue with technology, which was the third pillar of GDPR compliance when we spoke in the beginning about people, processes, and technology. I've said it before, a lot of people think, what does cybersecurity have to do with GDPR? You cannot be compliant with GDPR without taking security measures, without taking cybersecurity measures, technological or otherwise. It can also have to do with your office and things like that, but we've framed that under technology because often the measures are technological. So we've got 4 areas that we want to protect. We want to protect our devices. We want to protect our cloud applications that we're using or building. We want to protect our network equipment, and we want to protect our office. Now, on devices and cloud applications, there are a number of best practices which I've listed here. So on devices, make sure you have antivirus. You update when an update is becoming available. You ensure that the encryption and firewall are turned on. And finally, I've stated admin account, which means that you have a separate account that has admin rights that can, for instance, only admins can download software. Day to day, you'll then not run as an admin, meaning that if malicious software still gets through the cracks, you would have to input your admin password before it gets downloaded. And it's a great way to protect your devices and the data. Cloud applications, things to remember: multi-factor authentication, and multi-factor authentication, as well as a number of these things I've listed here. We'll share this with you, so have a read through it. Network equipment, there's many different ways of protecting network equipment, so it depends on your network. In some cases, if you work in a co-working space, you don't actually have control over the network, so that makes it harder. So then we want to look at things like VPNs. This is something I can't explain completely in the space of 1 minute, but think about your network, what your network looks like and how you might be able to protect it. You can find a lot of stuff online. And then office, we want to keep papers really to a minimum, never print out anything if you can. Make sure that when you walk away from your desk or your workspace that you don't leave anything unattended, you don't leave your laptop unlocked, etc. and CCTV is always a good idea if you can. So that's the technology out of people, processes, and technology. Now, here we've gone, I'm going to skip this one. We talked about this. Before I continue, are there any questions?
We don't have any questions at this point, but I know questions that were kind of sent over before the webinar. It kind of echoes a lot of what you were saying, Nadia, in regards to, I'm a freelancer. Why should I worry? My data is all saved in the cloud. Surely I'm all covered. And like you've kind of echoed the fact that it doesn't matter how small you are, everybody can be impacted. So I'm sure there is some kind of, there's obviously a bigger way we could expand on this, but I appreciate we've got 30 minutes. But can you elaborate on the kind of points that really, as a freelancer, you know, what should I remember?
Sure, absolutely. So I've prepared this a little bit. So a lot of people think GDPR only applies to big businesses or maybe the government, and that's absolutely not true. The GDPR does not limit itself. It does not discriminate against big companies, small companies, freelancers. It is applicable when you process data. So as soon as you have some form of personal data from anyone, you're responsible to, you need to abide by the GDPR. So in the same way that we find tax compliance incredibly important and crucial, which is why if you're not already, you should work with Integro, and if you are, they do an amazing job at that. The same way that you take care of your tax compliance, you need to take care of your GDPR compliance. Then also, a lot of people think it's only about avoiding fines. But that's really not the most important element, because your customers are usually the most important thing. They're your lifeline, they're the blood of your business. You wouldn't exist without them. So what you want to do is protect them. And how can you protect them? By following the rules that GDPR set out to help you protect your customers as well. So again, like, that doesn't matter how big or small you are. Some other myths, actually, Louisa, that I also sort of anticipated on, is that some people think, we touched upon this briefly in the beginning, but some people think that GDPR only affects companies based in the UK or the EU, but we said this before, which GDPR, or actually, in fact, which data protection regime is applicable to you doesn't depend on your location. It depends on the location of your data subject, so your customers, your employees, your contractors, your partners. If you have a customer in the US, let's say you have a customer in California, then the CCPA will apply to you, even though you're in the UK. If you have an employee from South Africa, then POPIA will apply to you, even though you're based in the UK or in Amsterdam or wherever you are. So location is your data subject and not you. And then finally, since we're debunking myths anyway, a lot of people think that GDPR compliance is sort of a task they can sort of check off their task list. I wish that was true. Unfortunately, it's not. It's an ongoing process. It is a continuous effort within your entire organization, big or small, throughout the rest of the life of your organization, big or small. GDPR compliance should be always taken into account in everything you do. You need to update your policies, redo the training, ensure continued compliance. So that's some of the most important last bits and pieces I wanted to discuss. So if there are no other questions, then I think we've literally spent 30 minutes, which I'm very impressed.
That was to the wire. And I think I can honestly say, I can speak for everyone when I say that was extremely useful and informative. I mean, GDPR, as an accountancy firm, data, our clients' information is just so important, and collaborating with yourself over the years, we realize is that the processes and everything that we do, just how taking the time to understand that and the impact it can have if we don't is just, it's carelessness if we don't take that time. So honestly, thank you so much. And I think off the back of that as well, it'd be really good to kind of some of the areas we covered about regarding processes and templates and dates and stuff and kind of areas like that. If we put some of that information together, that might be really helpful. I mean, for everyone that's attended, thank you so much. This is really a GDPR kind of, first stepping point. Hopefully we can do a more kind of deep dive to those that may benefit from a bit more of a, bit further information down the line. So that would be great to do down the, maybe next month or so. But this webinar will feature shortly on our website and on our YouTube channel, and the link will be emailed to all of our clients. So please keep an eye out for this. And the wonderful team at NAC have put together an exclusive GDPR package for us. So all the information will be emailed to everybody that's attended, all of our clients, and shared across the website. So any inquiries that we haven't had time to discuss today, anything specific to yourself, please email myself when you've got the meeting request, and I'll obviously get the information over to NAC, or likewise, any inquiries, please let us know. Thank you so much again, Nadia. Thank you to everyone again for joining, and hopefully we will see you at the next webinar soon. So take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.